Good evening, everyone. My name is Barbara Kolm. It's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you here tonight and especially introduce Nikos and Martin to you. Actually, Nikos and I should have discussed, but there was another event that I need to run. Somebody from the Trump administration is in town and we have another conversation, so please excuse me. But I have somebody in the very Hayekian way, spontaneous order, Martin Gundinger, our head researcher at the Austrian Economics Center, will have the debate with Nikos. Last time Nikos and I debated was in London a couple of years ago. As all good Austrian school scholars, division of labor, and having done that, I hand over to you. Have fun, enjoy, and apologies for not being able to join the discussion, but you're in excellent hands.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much for being here. So the first question to ask is, shall we even care about entrepreneurship and innovation? Because in Europe, this is never self-evident. I mean, most people out there do not lose much sleep on what is the level of research and development or innovation in Europe. And the reason for that is that they consider these issues completely irrelevant with their lives. They believe that entrepreneurship and innovation are issues that are relevant only to some boring people, the economists actually, people with grey suits and grey hair and a grey soul, or no hair, and they consider it as something completely outside of the domain of their life and interest. And that is a big mistake. Because the truth is that every single problem that we have can be either solved or become much better through entrepreneurship and innovation. And actually there are many problems that we would have, but we don't, because someone out there innovated in some way and solved it for us. And I don't want to speak in abstraction, so let me make it a bit more specific. So what have the entrepreneurs done for our lives, literally our everyday lives? So in Europe, we're very much proud of how much research and development we do. Like I was trying to do some research or innovation in Europe, and one of the metrics is we produce a lot of academic papers. Now I don't know what academic papers these are. Maybe they're engineer or they are gender studies, but there are a lot of academic papers. But if you think about it, the scientist is doing research out there. How does this research become relevant to your life, literally to your everyday life? It is through the intermediate figure of the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur makes scientific knowledge relevant to your life. The entrepreneur, in a way, makes the scientist work for you. He translates the scientific knowledge to the material improvement of your life. Or think about it this way. Usually, again, when we talk about entrepreneurship, no one would think about things like knowledge or spiritual development. Well, living in a country that hasn't got Amazon Prime, let me tell you something. This is a huge loss for my intellectual development. Living in Greece, and I've never used I don't use or deal with drugs, but I'm sure it's much easier to import drugs than it is to import a book from Amazon UK. I would have to go through fewer hoops to get it imported. Or think about how entrepreneurship literally adds life to our lives, because it saves us time, and time is all we have. And this is something which is so tangible, so specific. And yet, for the average person, no, it's just an issue for the technocrats. So if then entrepreneurship is indeed so important, so crucial to all the things that are important in our life, what are the factors that will decide whether a culture or a society will have a lot of entrepreneurship or a little of entrepreneurship? And most people would think it's just industrial policy or tariffs or regulation or lack of it. And all this is important. But I think there's something even more important than that. And this has to do with the culture of that society, with the values of that society. It's not a coincidence that for 99.9% of human history, there was no entrepreneurship and there was no innovation. That's not because there were not clever people around, there were many. But entrepreneurship needs two very important conditions. The first, the obvious one, is freedom. I don't need to tell you much more about that. I'm sure you all get the freedom to think, the freedom to produce, to create, the freedom to trade. But it also needs a second factor. And this second factor is, how to put it, like the British have a term, it's called cockiness, being cocky, being proud, having self-esteem, that I can change the world, that the world as it is not good enough, that there is this urgency that I want to do things to make this world a better place. I don't know how to put it, I know it's opposite. Do you know a phrase that the Spanish have, mañana? Like, we're going to do it later. In Greece, this is our creed for life. The entrepreneurs, if you think about it, it's the opposite. It's I want, like, I have this vision of how things should be, and I want to see it coming to reality. This idea that the world is mine to save, the world is mine to change. So if we want to see how is entrepreneurship faring in Europe, we need to ask, how does Europe deal with these two things? Let's start with freedom. Again, I'm speaking to the Austrian Economics Center. You don't need me to tell you that economic freedom in Europe is nowhere near where it should be. I was reading the other day that the Empire State Building was erected in less than 2 years. So I did some research, by which I mean I asked ChatGPT, how long would it take today to build a construction like the Empire State Building in Europe? And ChatGPT explained to me that it would take somewhere between 7 and 15 years. 2 years we'd only need for something which I didn't even know. You know, there's something called community engagement that you need to do before you build. Like, what is community? Why does someone who wants to produce and create have to jump through all these hoops? And who puts these hoops? People who have not created anything, people who have not produced anything. But okay, if economic freedom is not where it should be, what about then the other factor? This idea that we can change the world and we should do it with urgency. Throughout history, this idea was not popular, mostly because of religion. Today it's not popular because of a secular religion. And this secular religion is the ideology of environmentalism. And I don't want to, I believe that we face huge environmental challenges. I think, the science tells us that there are problems, but environmentalism is something else. It's an ideology. And actually, if you think about it, it's the most successful political ideology in history. Because name me one ideology which within 40 years became accepted throughout the axis of right and left. And even more, an ideology that became institutionalized. Environmentalism is institutionalized in EU policy and throughout international institutions, with, for example, the precautionary principle. And environmentalism tells you that you have to keep at arm's length any big impact on nature. Environmentalism tells you that nature is better left alone. And then under this prism, the entrepreneur is a suspicious figure. Is literally a disruptor. Is someone who is guilty until he's proven innocent. That's why he has to go through years and years of proving why his project will not be harmful. But I don't want you to think that the only reason we don't have more progress is because there are these crazy leftists or the Greens. Because these days, the right, particularly the new right, the new authoritarian right, it is also openly, at least skeptical, if not hostile to entrepreneurship. There is a book that came out recently by Alex Karp, the guy who runs Palantir. It's called The Technological Republic. This is a guy who has links to Trump, and this book has become something like the business manifesto of the new right, of the MAGA right. And if you read this book, it's actually scary. Because the main thesis of the book is that the problem with Silicon Valley, the mecca of entrepreneurship in the United States, the problem of Silicon Valley is that these people had too much freedom, and with that freedom, they did whatever they liked. not whatever the nation needed. So this guy gives the example of dating apps, of photo sharing apps. So why do you need these things, right? He said, we have bigger problems. The nation has bigger problems. So the way the new right envisions entrepreneurship is that the entrepreneur is going to be the servant of a bigger idea. The way the new right, the way the authoritarian right envisions entrepreneurship is that the central planner will play the music and the entrepreneur will dance. And of course, this is not a way to have innovation and entrepreneurship. If this was the way for progress, then Soviet Union would be the technological giant of the ages and would have overshadowed us. So that was the main point, that entrepreneurship has some conditions, and these conditions are not mostly, but to a big extent, ideological and cultural. And in Europe, we are losing in both areas, in the area of freedom and in the area that it's worth bringing change. So one last thing before we get to Martin. What can we do about all this? Because we are not, most of us are not entrepreneurs. I'm not going to produce this magic pill which is going to make you live longer. But we can still play a role. And the role we can play is boost the demand, the political demand for entrepreneurship. Because this demand in Europe is very, very low. In Europe, we usually get what we vote for. I come from a country, Greece, that in every single election, we got exactly what we voted for. There is no country where democracy really works in Greece. Every time we vote for statism of different kinds, and we get exactly this. So we need to make the culture more hospitable to entrepreneurship. So next time, for example, we see some bureaucrats dragging in committees and dragging in hearings about monopolies, some great producer, some great entrepreneur, we should be angry. We should get angry. We should recognize that this is an injustice that's happening here. And it is an injustice not just to them, it's also an injustice to you. Because at this moment, someone somewhere is creating and producing something brilliant. Something that might change your life. Forget change your life. Something that one day might save your life. And this mind can only operate in a culture, in a society of freedom. So that's why we fight for entrepreneurship and for freedom, because we love life. The fight for entrepreneurship at the end of the day is the fight for life. Thank you.
I'll try my best to add a few points on that. You already spoke a lot about the culture of freedom. The culture we have in Europe, unfortunately, is not a culture of freedom. It's a culture that prioritizes stability, security, safety. And actually, if you prioritize that in a culture, what you always get is stagnation, by definition, because that's what stability is. It's stagnation. It's deeply against life, because you already talked about life as well. So we have a kind of life-denying culture in Europe. And this, it seems to me at least, is the core of the issue, the real problem here. This culture implies a hostility to any kind of disruption, because people who don't like or want stability, of course, don't want any disruption. They want things to stay the same. And if you don't like disruption, what do you also not like? Entrepreneurs. And this is the root of the issue, in my opinion. We have a lot of other issues as well, and they go, for example, into surveillance, which we are also quite big in Europe. Because what does surveillance lead to? Well, not just you being observed and, you know, the saying of if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. I disagree, but that's a side point. What you get for most people is self-censorship, because people are afraid that some of the thoughts they think about could be against what the public wants, what the public is deeming acceptable. But what do all entrepreneurs have in common? They break some rules, not just legislative rules. I'm not primarily thinking about legislative rules, even though I think that if you want to be successful in Europe nowadays, you are in prison with one foot, because you probably, on the way to being successful, you have violated like 10 laws at the bare minimum. But it's kind of you have self-censorship coming out of that just because people are afraid. And if you have self-censorship, what do you also have? You have less ideas being discussed in the public sphere. And you see that in the internet. I personally grew up in the late 80s, got my first computer when I was 7 years old or something like that. We didn't even have internet back then. What we did have was a computer that didn't even have a visual operating system. It was just command line back then. And I was still fascinated by it because I saw the opportunities coming out of that. And then I got internet. My world completely changed. Because in the early internet, it was really the case that ideas were discussed freely. There were no legislations on the internet. There were pretty much no taboos. You could discuss pretty much any idea there. And that's the culture where Bitcoin came out of, where crypto, the whole cryptosphere, is a child of this culture. The same goes, for example, for WikiLeaks. Like it or hate it, but you will probably agree that WikiLeaks was something that put power in check. And I would argue that's very important. So self-censorship, big issue. What we also have is a hindered knowledge discovery process, and you already hinted at that. If you have more and more regulation, then some ideas don't even come to life, aren't discussed. We already talked about that. And because of that, if these ideas don't even come to life, then you also don't have this knowledge being created. You have less knowledge in the economy, and because of that, you have a less functioning economy. And last point I wanted to make, you talked about the institutionalization. Thank you. And I think this is a problem in itself. For example, take an issue like violence as the most extreme example. If you have institutionalization of violence, which we have by the state, then there tends to be a culture developing of kind of non-responsibility. So every layer in government, every layer in the institution tries to put the responsibility of any coercion they do to another layer. It's a culture that comes out of that is deeply non-responsible. If you don't have this institutionalization, then you have responsible people. And that's why, for example, I would make the case that there's probably less violence in a society where there is less institutionalization, for the simple reason that people have to be responsible for what they are doing. So that's pretty much my points for why there is less entrepreneurship going on in Europe. And yeah, maybe we could also go a little bit into the economic aspects of it. So Barbara already mentioned that one big factor is, of course, taxation. Another big factor is regulation. The issue I have is that I don't think in the current culture, which is based on stability, security, safety, we can do much about any of this until things get worse, like they did in Argentina. The public has to wake up, and I think the wake-up call. Just look at what happened now in Vienna with the last election. It didn't change anything. So things, unfortunately, in my opinion, have to get worse before they get better. And maybe we will have a society again where excellence is valued and not egalitarianism. But unfortunately, I don't see it currently. So, yes.
But you know something, I also think about this quite often. Do things need to go very, very bad till we have some improvement? I come from a country that things went as bad as it could have gone. Greece was the basket case of Europe. Probably you guys, I've got at least one salary from each one of you to bail out my country. How did this change Greece? Which was the first government that we voted for after the crisis? The radical left. Actually, I'll give you one example to understand how ideas are so strong that even when you are at the precipice of destruction, you don't make a U-turn. Those of you who are around my age or older, do you remember the old Athens airport? It was by the sea. Now, this area, when we built the new airport, an area which is huge, covers kilometers and kilometers. We used it for Olympic, we did construction during the Olympic Games, some stadiums that were never used again, some sports that we don't do. So after 2004, this area was vacant. This area is one of the most expensive pieces of land in Europe. Even during the crisis, you know what we did with this vast area, which is in front of the sea in the most beautiful suburbs? Absolutely nothing. And you know why? Because most people thought that if we did some construction there, that would be something horrible, which is called neoliberalism. So actually not let this land rot is neoliberalism. So Greece, whilst, okay, no, we didn't start, thanks to you guys partly, but Greece, that was, again, we were at the precipice of a disaster. We preferred not to do one of the obvious things, which was to open up our economy. I think we have the less free economy in Europe, with two exceptions, Belarus and Russia. If you take these countries out, we are at the bottom. And even during the crisis, we said, no, we don't want to do these things because we are proud and we're not going to let neoliberalism, whatever that means, do its things. So, I don't know, I'm a bit skeptical on, very often, I used to be a Marxist, so the Leninist in me, I always thought, okay, when disaster comes, that will be our moment. And I carried this with me after my transition, let's say, to the freedom movement. But I don't know, I have some second thoughts, but I'm curious also what the audience thinks on all this.